Imagine this. The year is 1636. You are a Puritan settler who had recently arrived in the Connecticut River Valley colony. Two local traders, John Stone and John Oldham, had been murdered by the Pequot, the Native American tribe occupying the region. Wanting to avenge their deaths, you and your fellow colonists launched a military expedition in retaliation. Little did you know, this show of military force would become only the first battle of the first sustained conflict between European settlers and indigenous peoples in northeastern North America. Hello there, and welcome to First Wars, a podcast about Native conflicts in America. I'm Ohad Goldhagen.
And I'm Karina Parsons.
And today, we're going to be talking about the Pequot War, the first extended conflict between European and Native forces in North America, specifically the English and their allies versus, you guessed it, the Pequot tribe of what is now Connecticut.
But in order to understand why English colonists went to war with the Pequot tribe, we need to wind the clock back a few years. In the early 1630s, Dutch settlers came to the area we would now consider the southeast of New England, seeking to establish trading outposts and colonial holdings. This region had been devastated in the decades prior by European plague, and major power shifts have only recently settled into the somewhat precarious balance that they were at the time. Dominating the economic, militaristic, and political landscape was the Pequot tribe, who controlled much of the area through a combination of smart diplomacy with other tribes, military might, and most importantly, control over the regional fur trade. The fur trade in North America was the very same reason the Dutch settlers came to the area, to get skins and pelts for selling in Europe, where they were considered a luxury. Unfortunately for the Dutch, the Pequot hadn't become the undisputed masters of the region through economic power alone, and after a small conflict, the two decided on a quasi-partnership, which provided the Dutch with the furs that they so desired. This partnership kept both sides happy. However, many native tribes under the Pequot were not. They chafed at being underlings to the more powerful tribe, and saw a way to rise to higher standing.
That way would rear its head in 1633, when Puritan settlers from the Massachusetts Bay Colony would arrive in the Connecticut River Valley. Unlike the Dutch, who were content to keep the balance of power in the region as long as they got their beaver pelts, the English were much more interested in permanent settlements and conquest. Even early on in the region, tensions between the settlers and the Native Americans were high. One factor contributing to this was the murder of John Stone, the first of many Johns in this tale, an English trader and his crew by the Pequot in the summer of 1634. The Pequot did provide several explanations for Stone's and his crew's deaths, but the English did not want to let the murders of their people at the hands of the Native Americans go unpunished. The Puritans established the Connecticut River Valley colony in 1636 and built alliances with the tribes ruled by the Pequot, and tensions continued to rise over a few months. Along with the violence in the region, the Pequot were allies of the Dutch, and thus enemies of the British by European standards. In spite of efforts to defuse the situation, the Pequot eventually had to stop aggressive English settlers from settling on their land, and when things got bloody, blame was put on their heads rather than the settlers. Eventually, however, things came to a head with the murder of John Oldham, who was murdered by the Native American inhabitants of Block Island.
In retaliation, the English governor ordered an armed expedition led by Captain John Endicott and made up of 90 soldiers and 4 officers to Block Island to demand retribution. After their negotiations broke down with the locals, they burned down several villages. This act would be the spark that lit the powder keg of the Connecticut River Valley and started the Pequot War.
Now that the stage has been set, we can talk about the war itself. While we won't cover every little battle in excruciating detail, we will cover the overall trends and most important battles and events. Ironically enough, at the start, the war almost immediately swung in the favor of the Pequot, who won minor victories in almost every engagement. Many British settlements and fortifications came under attack, and in spite of their best efforts, the Pequot were winning. See, while the British settlers weren't exactly professional soldiers, the Pequot had won their dominion over the Connecticut River Valley through war, just as much as peace, and their soldiers were superb fighters. Also, the British had never faced such a large, organized native resistance in this region before. While the Pequot had faced Europeans in open conflict, the Dutch-Pequot conflict mentioned earlier, which helped them fight the British. In spite of all of their conflict, the two European nations fought the same.
This isn't to say the British didn't have their victories, however. Many tribes, such as the Mohegan, the Narragansett, and the Saukjaug, would ally with the British, which would massively help in the coming months. Similarly, help would be sought from the other colonies in the area, most notably the Plymouth colony. While at first they were unwilling to help, by the end of the Mystic Campaign, the Plymouth had realized that the war against the Pequot had decisively shifted in the English's favor. They would declare war on the Pequot, and their forces would be vital in the final battles of the conflict.
The Mystic Campaign was undoubtedly the turning point in this war. As English forces and their allied Native Americans surrounded and stormed the Mystic Fort, they suffered nearly 50% casualties in less than half an hour of fighting. Then, they switched tactics and set fire to the fort before evacuating it. The English killed most fleeing natives and captured the rest, as they traveled to their ships in the Pequot harbor. More Pequot forces arrived from the Wenchauks village, and they launched a series of well-coordinated attacks on the English allied forces. After several miles of fighting and an unknown number of English casualties, the English reached their ships. The Pequot had suffered 100 to 200 more of their men killed or wounded.
After the Mystic Campaign, the Pequot War Council realized that the war had turned against them. Meeting shortly afterwards, they agreed that their best chance would be to flee to neighboring tribes and leave their homeland and the war behind. Thus, the final part of the war would begin, as the Pequot fled and the English and their allies pursued them. The primary focus of both sides was on the pursuit of Sassacus, who was one of the major war chiefs of the Pequot. As he fled west, the English pursued, and fought several battles seeking to catch him, but they were unable to. Eventually, Sassacus died at the hands of another tribe, and when evidence was delivered of his death, the war began to truly end. The Pequot and their allies simply did not have the ability to fight the English on the scale that they were fighting on for as long as they had been fighting for, and a few months after Sassacus was reported dead, the English declared that the Pequot had been subdued.
This war had multiple effects on the Pequot. The Treaty of Hartford that ended the war had forbidden the Pequots from regrouping as a tribe, and outlawed the name Pequot. Many Pequots were placed into slavery or under the control of other tribes. Eventually, the Pequots were able to reclaim their identity, but as two separate tribes, the Mashantucket, or Western Pequots, and the Paucatuck, or Eastern Pequots. A long-term result of this war is that a reduced sense of tribal pride made the Pequot more vulnerable to alcohol abuse and depression. As another result of the war, the other northeastern native tribes experienced the total warfare style of Europeans for the first time. The Puritans also experienced changes as a result of this war. After the war, the Puritans realized that there may be other conflicts with native peoples, and in 1643, representatives from the colonies of Plymouth, Connecticut, New Haven, and Massachusetts formed the United Colonies of New England, and this confederation determined the military conduct of the New England colonies during King Philip's War in 1675. The defeat of the Pequots also removed the only major obstacle to the expansion of the Puritans, and they could more easily spread throughout the Northeast, which would set the stage for the colonies of the region and the eventual conquest of the area by the British in the coming decades. This has been First Wars. Thank you for tuning in.